I left my reading glasses at the clinic. Of all the things to forget on a Tuesday evening, it had to be those. I'd driven 40 minutes back along Highway 7 through the dark. The kind of dark you only get in rural Ontario in December. Trees pressing close on both sides, stars nowhere to be seen behind the clouds. The waiting room was empty when I pushed open the door. The receptionist, a young woman I hadn't seen before, looked up from behind the desk. "Mr. Calloway, you're back." "Left my glasses," I said. She didn't hand them to me right away. Instead, she stood, glanced toward the hallway, then back at me. Her name tag read Claire Fontaine. She couldn't have been more than 26. "Sir," she said quietly, "can I ask you to wait just one moment?" Something in her voice made me stop. Not alarm exactly. More like the careful steadiness of someone holding a heavy thing and trying not to drop it. She picked up the phone, dialed an extension, and turned her back to me. I heard her say, almost in a whisper, "He came back." "Yes. Now. I think you need to come out." Dr. Anita Patel appeared from the far corridor 2 minutes later. She was my family physician of 11 years. A small, precise woman who wore the same style of silver stud earrings every single day. She was still in her white coat. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, not in 11 years. "Arthur," she said, "come into my office, please. I just came from my glasses." "I know." She held the door open. "Please." I sat in the same chair where I'd received my wife Margaret's cancer diagnosis 8 years ago. The familiarity of it made my chest tighten. Dr. Patel set a folder on the desk between us, then folded her hands on top of it. "Your son came in this afternoon," she said, "after your appointment. My son. Daniel, 41 years old, vice president of operations at Calloway Custom Cabinetry. The company had built over 38 years from a one-car garage in Kingston into a business that supplied handcrafted millwork to some of the finest homes and hotels between Ottawa and Toronto. 63 employees, 3 generations of craft in every dovetail joint and mortise. My father had taught me. I had taught Daniel. He came to update your file," Dr. Patel said carefully. "He told Claire he had power of attorney and needed to discuss your cognitive evaluation." "I don't have power of attorney filed with you," I said. "No," she said. "You don't. That's why Claire called me." She opened the folder. Inside was a printed document, 2 pages, bearing what appeared to be my signature at the bottom. "He left this," she said. "He said you'd signed it last week." I stared at my name. The signature was close. Very close. But the loop on the A was wrong. Margaret had pointed that out to me once, years ago, laughing over some birthday card I'd signed in a hurry. "You always rush the A, Arthur. It looks like an upside-down V." The signature had a proper loop. Careful. Practiced. Wrong. "That's not my signature," I said. Dr. Patel nodded slowly. "I didn't think so either." I sat with that for a moment. The heating system clicked on somewhere in the walls. Outside, a car moved through the parking lot, headlights sweeping briefly across the window blind. "What exactly did he say to Claire?" I asked. She slid a handwritten note across the desk. Claire's neat printing. Daniel had told her I was experiencing significant cognitive decline and had been diagnosed with early-onset dementia at a specialist office in Toronto. He'd said I was no longer capable of making sound decisions about my finances or the business. He'd asked that my file be flagged accordingly so that any instructions I gave in future appointments could be cross-referenced with him before being acted upon. He wanted to make me invisible, professionally unreliable, a man whose own doctor had been told in advance not to trust his judgment. I understood then, all at once, the way you understand something when the last piece drops into place and the picture becomes so clear it almost knocks the wind from you. The confusion I'd felt for months, the strange gaps, the mornings I'd come downstairs and couldn't remember whether I'd already taken my blood pressure medication. The time I'd driven to the Napanee lumber yard and stood in the parking lot for a full minute, unable to recall why I'd come. The board meeting in September, where I'd mixed up the Q3 and Q4 numbers, and Daniel had gently corrected me in front of everyone, his hand on my shoulder, his voice patient and kind. "It's okay, Dad. You've had a lot on your mind." It wasn't age. It wasn't stress. Something else entirely had been erasing me. But first, I said to myself, not really to Dr. Patel, I need to know exactly what he's been doing. She looked at me steadily. What can I do to help? I picked up my glasses from the corner of her desk where Claire had set them. My hands were shaking. I made them stop. Order a full blood panel, I said. Tonight if possible. Everything, and don't tell anyone you've done it. She nodded once. I'll call the lab in Belleville. You can go now and they'll take you. Anita. I stood. How long has he been coming here without my knowledge? She looked down at the folder. Claire found 2 earlier notes in the system. August. October. 6 months. The same 6 months I'd been losing myself. The lab was a 20-minute drive. I sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent lighting while a technician named Marcus drew 4 vials of blood with the efficient cheerfulness of someone who had done this 10,000 times. I watched the dark red fill each tube and thought about Daniel at 17, sitting beside me at the bandsaw, learning to read the grain of a piece of white oak. Feel it first, Dad. That was what I'd told him. Before you cut, feel which way it wants to go. He'd had good hands. Patient hands. He'd been worth every hour I'd put into teaching him. I drove home through the dark and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the lights. Margaret's photograph was on the shelf above the wood stove, taken at the cottage in Frontenac Provincial Park the summer before her diagnosis, her red sweater bright against the granite shore, laughing at something I'd said that I could no longer remember. I remembered the laugh. You built something real, Arthur. That was what she'd said, near the end, when the hospital had become our whole world. Don't let anyone undo it. I had not listened carefully enough to that sentence. My phone rang at just past midnight. It was Marcus from the lab. Mr. Marcus from the lab. Mr. Calloway, I'm sorry to call so late. Dr. Patel asked me to reach out directly if anything flagged urgently. A pause. 2 things came back abnormal. Your acetylcholinesterase levels are significantly suppressed, and we found trace amounts of organophosphate metabolites in your bloodstream. I was a cabinetry, not a chemist, but I'd spent 38 years working with wood finishes, solvents, preservatives. I knew enough. Organophosphate, I said, like in pesticides. Yes, sir. At low chronic exposure levels, it would cause exactly the symptoms Dr. Patel mentioned in her intake notes. Memory gaps, difficulty concentrating, occasional disorientation. Over months, it builds up in the system. Low chronic exposure. Not a single dose, a slow accumulation, delivered over time in small enough quantities to mimic the natural forgetting of a man past 60. After I hung up, I sat for a long time without moving. Daniel visited the property every Sunday for dinner. He'd started bringing groceries 6 months ago. You don't need to be running around to the store every week, Dad. Let me take care of it. He brought bread, coffee, cheese from that shop in Kingston. He knew I liked. He brought the herbal supplement capsules he'd found online, some Bevamin complex he'd read was good for cognitive health in older men. Just try them, Dad. What's the harm? I got up and went to the kitchen cupboard. The orange supplement bottle was there, half empty. I unscrewed the lid and tipped a capsule onto my palm. I didn't open it. I just set it on the counter and looked at it in the dark. I thought about the business. Calloway Custom Cabinetry was worth somewhere between $8 and $9 million at current valuation. The workshop in Kingston, the showroom on Princess Street, the contracts we held with 4 hotel development groups along the 401 corridor, the reputation we'd built over nearly 4 decades. If I were declared cognitively unfit, Daniel would assume control without a sale, without a vote, without a buyout. He would inherit it sideways, through my incapacity rather than my death, while I was still alive and breathing and simply no longer considered capable of disagreeing. I had to find out how far this had gone, and I had 4 days before Friday. Friday was the annual partnership review, the one day each year when all 3 of my senior partners, Paul Desjardins, Cynthia Kwan, and Roger Thibault, gathered at the Kingston office with our business lawyer, Frank Okafor, to review operations, financials, and succession planning. Daniel had scheduled a presentation. He'd told me it was a growth strategy overview. He'd been very pleasant about it. I called Paul Desjardins at 7 the next morning. Paul had been with me for 22 years, had started as a Finnish carpenter, and worked his way into a 15% equity stake. He answered on the first ring. "Arthur, you're up early." "Paul, I need you to listen to me carefully and not ask me to explain everything right now. Can you do that?" A pause. "Yes. Before Friday's meeting, I need you to go through the last 6 months of purchase orders and supplier contracts, everything Daniel signed off on, and pull anything that strikes you as unusual. Don't discuss it with anyone in the office, not even Cynthia." Another pause, longer. "Arthur, is everything all right?" "Not entirely, but it will be. Thursday night I need you at the office, after hours. Bring what you find." "I'll be there," he said simply. That was Paul. 38 years I'd known him. You don't need to explain everything to a man like that. He just shows up. I spent Wednesday doing what I had not done in 6 months, being myself. I drove to the Kingston workshop and walked the floor, spoke to the craftsman, ran my hand along the edge of a white oak panel coming off the planer, felt the surface the way my father had taught me. The foreman, a third-generation woodworker named Gilles Beaumont, watched me from across the floor and said nothing. But when I caught his eye, he nodded once. He'd noticed the change. That evening, I went through Daniel's home office. He kept a desk in the spare bedroom at the property, used it when he stayed over on weekends. The desk was unlocked. The arrogance of that still bothers me. Either he trusted me completely, or he no longer considered me capable of understanding what I found. In a second drawer, behind a folder of old tax returns, there was a printed email chain. The other party was a man named Garrett Sloan, managing partner of an investment group called Northgate Acquisition Partners, based in Mississauga. The chain went back 8 months. The emails outlined a plan to acquire Calloway custom cabinetry through a private transaction structured as a management buyout. The listed purchase price was $4.2 million, roughly half the actual valuation. The condition of the deal was that I be formally assessed as cognitively unfit for business management, at which point Daniel, as assumed power of attorney holder, could authorize the sale without my consent. Northgate would then rebrand the company, dissolve the Kingston workshop, and redirect the existing hotel contracts to their own manufacturing network in Brampton. 63 employees. 38 years. My father's tools, still hanging on the pegboard above my workbench. Gone. All of it gone, for $4.2 million split between my son and Garrett Sloan. At the bottom of the chain there was a message from Sloan dated 3 weeks ago. Timeline on track. Proceed with Thursday confirmation at the clinic, and we move to documentation phase the following week. Thursday confirmation at the clinic. The day Daniel had gone to see Claire Fontaine with a forged power of attorney document. I sat in the dark of that spare room for a long time. The house made its small sounds around me. The furnace, the creak of a floor joist, the particular silence of a house where only one person lives. Margaret's absence had never felt so loud. I picked up the phone and called Frank Okafor. "Frank, it's Arthur Calloway. I know it's late." "Arthur." His voice was calm. Frank had been our business lawyer for 19 years. He was the kind of man who kept his voice exactly the same at midnight as he did at noon. "What do you need?" "I need you at the office Friday morning, early. Bring everything you have on the succession clause in the partnership agreement." "I'll be there at 8, he said. "And Frank, don't call Daniel." A brief silence. "Understood." Thursday. I played the role I'd been unwillingly rehearsing for 6 months. When Daniel came by that evening with a bag of groceries, and that careful, solicitous manner he'd been wearing like a coat all autumn, I let my hands shake on the door handle. I let myself seem vague about what day the board meeting was. I said I'd been having headaches again. He stood in the kitchen and watched me with his father's eyes, and I had to look away. "Dad," he said gently, "after Friday you can step back. You won't have to manage any of this anymore. You can just rest." "I'm tired," I said. Which was true, though not in the way he meant. He stayed for an hour. Before he left, he refilled my supplement bottle from a new package he'd brought, pressing the orange cap back on and setting it on the counter beside the kettle, right where I'd always kept it. Thoughtful. Careful. My son, after his taillights disappeared down the driveway, I took the bottle, sealed it in a plastic bag, and labeled it. Evidence. I replaced it with a multivitamin bottle from the back of the cupboard. Same color, same size. I started taking the zinc and acetylcholine support supplements Dr. Mintz Patel had recommended, the real ones, along with the activated charcoal she'd suggested to help clear my system faster. Paul met me at the Kingston office at 10 that night. He spread 6 months of paperwork across the boardroom table, supplier contracts, purchase orders, 2 lease amendments on the Princess Street showroom, and a consulting agreement signed by Daniel that I had never seen or authorized, paying a numbered company $32,000 for operational strategy services. The numbered company, when Paul had traced it through the Ontario Business Registry that afternoon, resolved to a holding account linked to Garrett Sloan. "He's been billing the company," Paul said. His voice was very quiet, "for advice on how to sell it out from under you." I looked at the consulting agreement for a long time. Then I set it face down on the table. "The vintage inventory," I said. Paul looked up. Among the assets of Calloway Custom Cabinetry was something unusual, a collection of archive pieces, 64 original cabinet samples, display units, and prototype installations we produced over the decades, some dating back to my father's era. They were stored in the back of the workshop and carried on the books at modest value. In reality, 3 of the hotel development groups we contracted with had expressed serious interest in acquiring the archive as design inspiration pieces. The real value was closer to $500,000. Daniel's acquisition deal with Northgate priced them at 0. "Move the archive," I said, "tonight. Everything to the storage unit in Napanee. Leave the display cases in place, but empty them. If anyone asks, they've gone for restoration." Paul didn't argue. He picked up his phone and called Gilles Beaumont. By 2 in the morning, every original piece was gone. The cases stood like empty frames along the workshop wall, still lit, still impressive at a glance, meaning nothing. I went home and slept 4 hours, and woke up Friday morning clear-headed in a way I hadn't been in half a year. I dressed in the charcoal suit I'd worn to Margaret's funeral, and to the opening of the Princess Street showroom, and to every significant moment in between. I drank Rio coffee, black, and tasted it properly for the first time in months, the bitterness and the dark roast and the faint sweetness underneath. I stood in the kitchen and just tasted it for a moment. On the shelf above the wood stove, Margaret smiled from Frontenac Park. "I hear you," I said. The Kingston office was on Brock Street, 2nd floor above a tile showroom overlooking the flat winter light off Lake Ontario. I arrived at 8. Frank was already there with his briefcase open, the partnership agreement and its succession clauses laid out on the table. I spent 40 minutes with him going over exactly what I needed. At 9, Paul arrived with Cynthia Kwan and Roger Thibault. I'd called them both the night before, said only that I had something important to share before the formal meeting. They'd come without questions. At 9:15, I called Detective Sandra Chone. Sandra had been with the Kingston Police Service for 23 years. We'd known each other since our children went to Frontenac Secondary at the same time, back when the city felt smaller. She'd helped us once before, years ago, when the workshop had a break-in. She answered on the second ring. "Arthur, your message last night, are you sure about all this?" "Completely. I'll be there at 10, she said. I'll be quiet until you give me the word." Daniel arrived at 9:50 with a leather satchel and that same careful pleasantness he'd been wearing for months. Francine, his wife, was not with him. He walked into the boardroom, saw the assembled partners, saw Frank, and I watched something cross his face. A flicker of adjustment, a recalculation. "Dad," he said. "You look well." "I feel well," I said. He set his satchel down and drew out a presentation folder. The partners watched him with the polite neutrality of people waiting to understand the situation before choosing a side. Frank sat with his hands folded on the table, expression unreadable. "I thought today," Daniel began, "we'd talk about the future of the company, some strategic options I've been exploring." "Before we do that," I said, "I'd like to show everyone something." I laid the printed email chain on the table. The Northgate correspondence. 8 months of it, his name and Garrett Sloan's at the top of every page. Then the consulting agreement, the one billing the company for advice on how to dismember it. Then the forged power of attorney document Dr. Patel had given me. Claire Fontaine's handwritten notes stapled to the front. Then the lab report, my blood work, organophosphate metabolites, suppressed acetylcholinesterase, 6 months of documented poisoning. Daniel didn't move. His face went very still, the particular stillness of a man calculating whether there is still a way through. The supplement capsules you've been bringing me, I said, are currently in a sealed bag on their way to the Center of Forensic Sciences in Toronto. They've been there since yesterday afternoon. Cynthia Kwan's hand was over her mouth. Roger Thibault had gone pale. Paul sat with his arms crossed, watching Daniel with the expression of a man who has built things with his hands his whole life and has no patience for the kind of man who tears them down. Frank spoke first, in his precise, even way. The succession clause in the partnership agreement requires unanimous partner consent for any transfer of ownership. A power of attorney, even a valid one, does not supersede that clause. In the event of any proceeding against this company's ownership structure, these documents would be the first exhibits filed. Daniel looked at me. For a long moment there was nothing between us but the sound of the radiator under the window and the muffled traffic from Brock Street below. The archive, he said quietly. The collection in the workshop. Gone, I said. Since 2 o'clock this morning. Something went out of his face. I thought of him at 12 years old, standing on an upturned milk crate to reach the workbench, sanding a small oak box he was making for Margaret's birthday, his tongue pressed to the corner of his mouth in concentration. I thought of driving him to hockey practice at 5:30 in the morning in January, the two of us eating drive-through egg sandwiches in the dark parking lot of the Invista Center before the rink opened. I thought of the day I handed him the VP title and told him what I had built was also his. I had not failed him the way I thought I had. I had loved him the way a father loves. What came after that was his choosing, not mine. The door opened. Detective Sandra Choom came in with a uniformed officer behind her. She looked at me and I nodded once. She crossed to Daniel and began to speak in the measured, careful language of rights and charges. Fraud, forgery, criminal negligence causing harm, conspiracy. He stood and listened. He didn't make a scene. He didn't cry. He looked at me once, at the end, before they took him out, and I made myself hold his gaze. The room was very quiet after the door closed. Roger Thibault let out a long breath. Cynthia was still for another moment, then opened her notebook as if searching for somewhere useful to put her hands. What happens now? Paul asked. Now, I said. We run the meeting. We did. Frank walked us through the succession clause amendments he drafted that morning, strengthening the consent requirements so that nothing like this could be approached again without full partner transparency. Cynthia presented the Q4 numbers. Roger had a new contract inquiry from a hotel group in Ottawa. I took notes. My handwriting was steady. 3 months later, the ice went out on the St. Lawrence, and the light came back to Kingston the way it always does, all at once and then everywhere. I was in the workshop on a Wednesday afternoon, at my own bench, working on a commission, a maple display cabinet for a family in the Westboro neighborhood of Ottawa. 2 kids, they told me, and they wanted something that would last. I was fitting the drawer slides by hand, the old way, checking the tolerance with a feeler gauge. Gilles came to stand beside me. He watched me work for a moment, the way craftsmen do, in silence. She's coming out well, he said. She is. He went back to his own bench. The radio was on, a French station out of Gatineau, the volume low enough that you could hear the tools over it. Outside the workshop windows, the sky over Lake Ontario was the particular hard blue of an Ontario spring morning that makes you forget how long the dark lasted. Claire Fontaine had called me the week before. She'd accepted a position at a family medicine clinic in Perth and wanted to say goodbye. I drove over to the clinic and we had coffee in the waiting room, in the plastic chairs, the same ones. She was 26 and direct and had a way of sitting completely still when she was listening, as though she considered attention a form of courtesy. I'd brought a small envelope. Inside was a note and a check. The note said only, "What you did took courage. Courage that size deserves to be rewarded properly. This is for your future." Margaret would have wanted to say thank you herself. She'd tried to hand it back. I told her she could try harder than that, but she wasn't going to succeed. She laughed, a surprised and genuine laugh, and put the envelope in her coat pocket. I thought about that laugh on the drive home. The way a small, honest thing can sit in the chest for days. Back at my workbench, I set the drawer slide in its channel and pushed it home. It moved without resistance, silently, exactly the way a well-made thing should move. I thought about my father's hands teaching mine. I thought about Margaret's voice. I thought about 63 employees who would come to work tomorrow not knowing how close they'd come to losing everything, and I was glad they would never have to know. Daniel's lawyer had called twice. I hadn't returned the calls. There would be a process. Courts and documents, and the formal accounting of what he'd done, and I would be present for all of it with the same steadiness I brought to every hard thing in my life. But that was a different room from this one. In this room there was maple, and the smell of finish, and the sound of someone in the corner running a hand plane over a piece of cherry. The shush and the resistance, and then the shush again. The oldest sound in my life. I set down the feeler gauge and picked up the drawer front, turned it in the light to check the grain alignment. Good wood. Honest wood. You could see everything. It was right there on the surface. Every year it had grown, every season it had survived, the whole truth of it. I set it carefully into position. I am one of those men who will be remembered in workshop stories, if at all. Not a grand story, not a story worth a biography. The kind that gets told at the end of a workday, leaning against a truck in a parking lot, while the light goes. I heard about Calloway. Did you know his own son tried to? And then the part about the young woman at the clinic desk who picked up the phone, and the part about the Paul Desjardineses of the world, who show up without needing an explanation. I used to think that what I was building was a company, a legacy in lumber and joinery and honest trade, but you do not build that alone. You build it with the people who choose to stand beside you, the ones who answer at midnight, the ones who move an archive in the dark without asking why, the ones who look up from a reception desk and decide that their 30-second job is worth less than a stranger's safety. That is what I would tell you if you asked. Do not confuse blood with loyalty. Do not mistake familiarity for trust. The people who will save your life are often the ones you haven't thought to count yet. Margaret knew this. She always did. The maple drawer slid home without a sound. I do not tell the story to frighten you. I tell it because if you are past 60 and someone close to you is very, very helpful, you are allowed to ask yourself why. You are allowed to be inconvenient. You are allowed to say, I am still here. This is still mine. And I am paying attention. Pay attention. What would you have done in my place? Tell me where in the world you're hearing this. I'd like to know.